Under the gray sky of post-war Louisiana, 1871, silence had a different sound, not peace, but memory. The cane fields were quiet now, the air heavy with what had been lost and what still refused to die. Ezekiel had once been a slave on that very land, the Green Hill plantation. He was born in its dirt, whipped in its barns, and prayed in the shadows of its magnolia trees. But now, for the first time, he returned not as a slave, but as a judge. The carriage that brought him from Baton Rouge rolled slowly along the same road where he once carried heavy baskets of cane on his shoulders. His hands, once scarred and calloused from hard labor, now rested inside pristine white gloves. The same hands that had once known the cold bite of chains now held the power to sentence a man to death. He didn't return seeking justice, not in the simple sense. He returned because a name was written on a case file before his court, Green Hill, and the accused were the sons of his former master, Charles Beaumont. The courthouse in St. Francisville was small, built of brick and filled with memory. As he entered, whispers followed him. "That's the colored judge," they said. Some spoke in awe, others in pure disbelief. The Civil War had ended 6 years ago, but freedom still cast a long, dark shadow, a fact Ezekiel knew all too well. When he stepped into the courtroom, he saw them, Robert and Thomas Beaumont, the same boys who once called him Ezzy when they were small. He had carried them on his shoulders as children, chased them through the fields, taught them how to skip stones across the creek. But as they grew older, they forgot that shared history. They became their father's sons, cruel, proud, and unseeing. Now they stood accused of murder. They had beaten a freedman to death over a piece of land that once belonged to their father's plantation. The bitter irony wasn't lost on Ezekiel. They had killed a man for a field they had already lost in the war. The courtroom was shrouded in a tense silence as Ezekiel read the testimony aloud. The witnesses were black men who had once worked beside him in those very fields. Their voices trembled, but they spoke. Words like whip, fire, and blood echoed through the hall like ghosts from a past that refused to stay buried. Robert and Thomas sat with pale, frightened faces, while their lawyer insisted it was all just a matter of self-defense. But Ezekiel didn't rush. Every question he asked carried the weight of history. Every pause he took reminded the room that the world had been turned on its head. The sons of the master now stood where slaves had once knelt in fear. As the trial continued, Ezekiel's nights were haunted by vivid dreams. He saw Charles Beaumont, the old master, sitting on his porch, sipping bourbon, staring at him with cold, accusing eyes. "You think freedom changes the soil, boy?" The ghost would whisper. "The roots remember." He'd wake up each night drenched in sweat, staring at his reflection in the wash basin. Some nights he didn't even recognize the man looking back at him. On the final day of the trial, the room was packed to the rafters. The sun poured through the tall windows, slicing the tense air into pale, dusty lines. The prosecutor spoke of unimaginable cruelty, of a man murdered for simply daring to own a piece of land once worked by slaves. The defense attorney spoke of heritage, honor, and the chaos that followed the war. When it was time for the verdict, the jury, 12 white men, looked deeply uneasy. You could see the conflict in their eyes. They didn't want to convict the Beaumont sons, but they couldn't ignore the mountain of evidence against them. And the judge's gaze, steady and unblinking, was heavier than any sermon they had ever heard. The verdict came, guilty. Gasps and murmurs rippled through the courtroom. Robert and Thomas stood frozen, their faces drained of all color. One of them, in a desperate whisper, said, "Ezzy, please." That single word hit Ezekiel like a knife. For a fleeting moment, he wasn't a judge. He was the boy in the cane field again, hearing his name called by voices that had once laughed with him, then mocked him, and finally owned him. He stood, his black robe feeling impossibly heavy on his shoulders, but his voice was steady, unwavering. "By the laws of this state, and by the truth of what's been laid before this court," he announced, "you are found guilty of murder in the second degree." Thomas finally broke down, shouting in rage and disbelief, "You were nothing. You were one of us." For the first time, Ezekiel's eyes trembled. He wanted to scream. He wanted to tell them everything, how their father had whipped his mother to death, how he had buried her himself under the pecan tree behind the barn, how every night he could still hear her humming, but he didn't. He said only one thing, his voice clear and resonant: "I was never one of you. I was what your father made me, and what God made me after." When the gavel struck the wood, the echo filled the courthouse like a clap of thunder. Afterward, he stayed behind as the people cleared out. This very courthouse, where he had just passed judgment on 2 white men, was once a place where slaves had been sold like cattle. The irony was not justice, he thought. It was memory finally finding its rightful place. That night, he returned to the old plantation. The great house was in ruins, its broken walls consumed by crawling vines. He walked to the backfield, to the old pecan tree. The moon hung low in the sky, pale and wide. He knelt there, pressing his hand against the cool earth. He whispered, "Mama, it's done." The wind moved through the tall grass, and it felt as soft as her hand brushing through his hair. For the first time in his life, he cried without shame. As he turned to leave, he saw something strange. His reflection in a shard of glass in the old barn window. For a split second, it looked like the young boy he once was, barefoot and thin, his eyes filled with fear, but when he blinked, it was gone. Only his own weary, aged face remained. Ezekiel walked away slowly, his cane tapping a steady rhythm on the earth. The world behind him was dying, but ahead, something new was being born. He didn't know what it was, or if it would last. But for the first time, the soil under his feet didn't belong to anyone else. He didn't bury his past. He carried it, and in doing so, he became something more than a master or a slave. He became a man who judged the world that had once judged him. The next morning, as he boarded the carriage back to Baton Rouge, a young black boy waved at him from the roadside. Ezekiel lifted his hand and smiled. Maybe that was all freedom ever truly meant, not forgetting, but forgiving without surrender. And as the carriage rolled on, the Louisiana sunlight poured through the trees, the same light that had once burned on chains now falling on a man who had finally learned how to walk unbound. Thank you so much for watching. If this story moved you, please consider hitting that like button and subscribing for more narratives that explore the depths of the human spirit. We'll see you in the next one.